What's up, TUMNAD Lectures? In today's video, we are going to be talking about the salivary glands. If it's your very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe. You put on the notification bell so that whenever I load a video, you become the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the salivary glands, okay? So now, the salivary glands, these are going to be one of the most important kind of the tiny structures, which are going to be aiding in what we call production of what we call the saliva in the oral cavity, okay? So now we are going to be following this kind of the objectives. You're going to be looking at what we call the types of the salivary glands. We look at the functions of what we call the saliva. We look at the histology part of the salivary glands. And then finally, so I'll talk about briefly about what we call the nerve supply. So let's go ahead and get started and look at the different types of what we call the salivary glands, okay? So now, when we talk about salivary glands, you're going to be having two types of the salivary glands. We have those kind of the salivary glands which are going to be located within the oral cavity, inside the oral cavity. And then we also have that kind of the type of the salivary glands that are going to be outside the oral cavity. In that way, we are going to be having the first one as what we call intrinsic. We have what we call intrinsic salivary glands. You may even find some other sources giving you what we call minor, okay, giving what we call minor salivary glands, okay. And again, of course, we have said that we also have those kind of the salivary glands that are going to be outside the oral cavity. Those ones are going to be what we call extrinsic, okay, are going to be what we call extrinsic. You may find some other books, some other sources calling it the major salivary glands. What we call the major salivary glands. So now these are the two categories of the salivary glands that are going to be providing what we call the saliva. So now let's go ahead and see what are those examples of these kind of the types of the salivary glands. So now, for the case of the intrinsic salivary glands, okay, we are going to be finding them within the oral cavity, and the following are the examples of the intrinsic salivary glands. The first one, you're going to be having those kind of salivary glands are going to be located on the cheeks, on the tongue, on the palate, and even also on what we call the vestibule. Okay, so now you're going to be having what we call the buccal. Okay, we're going to be having what we call the buccal. Okay, we're going to be having what we call the palatine. Okay, we're going to be having what we call the palatine. We are going to be having what we call the lingual. Okay, we're going to be having what we call the lingual, and even also what we call the labial. Okay, what we call the labial. So now these are going to be all what we call the intrinsic salivary glands, which are going to be residing inside the oral cavity. Okay, so now something which is going to be unique with these intrinsic salivary glands is that for them they are producing saliva at a constant rate. Okay, they are producing saliva at a constant rate. Okay, produces saliva produces saliva at a constant rate. Okay, that is something which is very important to note, that for them all the time they are ever secreting what we call saliva. And the saliva coming from what we call the intrinsic salivary glands accounts for approximately 10% of the entire saliva secretions. Okay, so now it accounts for only 10% of the saliva which is located within the oral cavity. Okay, so now if you extract the saliva within the oral cavity, 10% is going to be coming from what we call the intrinsic, or what we call the minor salivary glands. Okay, so now that is for the case of the intrinsic or minor salivary glands. Okay, they are located within the oral cavity inside. So now let's go ahead and see the examples of the extrinsic salivary glands or the major salivary glands that are going to be outside the oral cavity. Okay, the following are the examples of the extrinsic salivary glands. The first one is what we call the parotid. Okay, the first one is what we call the parotid salivary gland. Okay, and then the second one, the parotid salivary gland. Okay, the parotid salivary gland. Okay, and then the second one is what we call the submandibular salivary gland. Okay, what we call the submandibular. Okay, submandibular salivary gland. And then the last one is what we call the sublingual. what we call the sublingual, okay, sublingual salivary gland. Okay, so now under the extrinsic salivary glands, these are the main examples of the extrinsic salivary gland, and of course the parotid gland is the largest extrinsic salivary gland. Super very important and beautiful. Okay, so now having seen this kind of the extrinsic salivary gland, these ones, they are going to be producing saliva following a stimulus. That is super very important. In other words, extrinsic salivary glands, they release secretions following a stimulus. Okay? They require, these ones, they require what we call a stimulus. Okay, they require what we call a stimulus. For example, if you have sight of food, or even you have what we call thought of food, or even smell of food, this is when these extrinsic salivary glands are going to be more active in producing what we call the saliva. And the saliva and oral cavity produced by what we call the extrinsic salivary glands approximate what we call the account. Okay, the saliva coming from what we call the extrinsic salivary glands account for approximately 90%. Okay, account for approximately 90%. So now 90% of the saliva in the oral cavity is going to be part coming from what we call the extrinsic, or what we call the major salivary glands. Okay. So now, having seen all the types of what we call the salivary glands, let me go ahead and show you what we call the extrinsic salivary glands, and even where they're going to be residing. Okay. So now here is a diagrammatic illustration showing the extrinsic salivary glands. Okay. So now when you see this kind of the salivary gland, that's just going to be in front of the ear. Okay, in front of the ears, but slightly inferior. The whole of this area, you're going to be having this kind of the salivary gland. You know how do we call this kind of salivary gland? This is what we call the parotid salivary gland. Okay, so now this one here is what we call the parotid. Is what we call the parotid. Okay, what we call the parotid salivary gland. Okay, that is the parotid salivary gland, one of the largest extrinsic salivary gland. Okay. Then this one, which is just going to be just what we call beneath what we call the mandible, okay, or the lower jaw. This kind of the salivary gland, that's just going to be located just on the lower jaw, okay, down here. This one is what we call the submandibular salivary gland, okay, submandibular salivary gland, okay. And then also we also have these kind of the salivary glands, which are going to be residing just under the tongue. Okay, they just located under the tongue. You know how do we call this one? They are simply called the sublingual salivary glands. Okay, so now these ones here, they are what we call the sublingual. Okay, they are sublingual salivary glands. Okay, they are the sublingual salivary glands. Okay, so now those are the three extrinsic salivary glands that are going to be secreting saliva into the oral cavity. So now you may ask yourself, if they are going to be outside the oral cavity, but how does the saliva leave these salivary glands to the oral cavity? What do you think is going to be now the route that's going to be taking the saliva to the oral cavity from these extrinsic salivary glands? It means that these salivary glands, they're going to be having ducts. They're going to be having the ducts through which the saliva has to move until it flows into what we call the oral cavity. So now let's go ahead and see those kind of the ducts that allows the flow of saliva from these different extrinsic salivary glands. Okay. So now when we come to what we call the parotid salivary gland, it is going to be having this tube. Okay, we have this tube that allows the saliva to come all along from the parotid salivary glands into the oral cavity. And generally, this kind of the duct, it opens on what we call upper second molar. Okay, what we call the upper second molar, that's where you're going to be having now the opening of the duct that is pulling saliva direct from the parotid gland. You know how this duct is called? This duct here is what we call the Stenson's duct. Okay, so now this duct here is what we call the Stenson's. Okay, the Stenson's duct. Okay, and then there is another simplest name. You can just call it the parotid duct. Okay, you may even simply call it the parotid duct. Okay. Then we also have what we call the submandibular salivary glands. We have this duct that is going to be now pulling this kind of the saliva and allows it to flow generally around at the base of the tongue. Okay, that's where it's going to be opening at the base of the tongue, where the tongue is going to be starting from. That's where you're going to be having the opening of this duct. You know how this duct is called? This duct here that is pulling saliva from the submandibular salivary glands is just called the Wharton's. Is what we call the Wharton's. What we call the Wharton's duct. Okay, but you can even simply call it the submandibular duct. Okay, it is such another beautiful thing. Okay, then we also have what we call the sublingual salivary gland that is going to be secreting saliva, and its kind of duct is going to be opening underneath the tongue. You know, at the tongue we have what we call the lingofrenulum, that kind of the tissue which is going to be separating the two parts of what we call the tongue, just on the inferior aspect. So now you're going to be having the opening of this kind of the ducts from the sublingual salivary gland. You know how this kind of this saliva or this duct is called? These ducts, which are going to be coming from the sublingual salivary glands, they are just simply called the ducts of Rivinus. Okay, you see this kind of this duct here. This duct here is what we call the duct. Of Rivinus. Okay, the duct of Rivinus. But you may even simply call it the sublingual duct, as simple as that. So now we are realizing that we're going to be having these ducts that are going to be helping in the movement of the saliva direct from what we call this kind of the salivary glands. Okay, so now that is what we call the ducts that's going to be allowing the movement of the saliva into the oral cavity. Okay. So now, having seen that, let's go ahead and see the histology part of what we call the salivary glands. We need to know what are those kind of the cells that really make this kind of different types of the salivary glands. Okay, so now let's see what we call the histology part. The histology part of what we call the salivary glands. Okay, so now, of course, when we are talking about the histology, we are meaning the cellular makeup. Which kind of the cells do we find in what we call the salivary glands? So now, there are going to be two kind of cells that are going to be making up what we call the salivary glands. Okay, we have two types of the cells. We are going to be very many, but there are generally two kind of cells. And what are these two cells? You know, these cells which are going to be a bit red. These kinds of cells which are going to be red. This one here, they are what we call the serous. They are what we call the serous cells. Okay, the serous acini cells. And then of course these cells which are a bit black are what we call the mucus. Okay, are what we call the mucus cells. We may find some people writing it the mucus acini cells. These are the two main categories of cells that are going to be making up what we call the salivary gland. So now let's go ahead and see this parotid gland, which kind of the cells are going to be making it. Okay, so now starting with the parotid gland. Parotid gland. So now, just looking from this one here, if we cut a small piece of the salivary gland, which we are calling the parotid gland, and we zoom it inside, we are going to be seeing what we call the serous cells. For that reason, parotid salivary glands are just going to be made up of what we call the serous cells. Okay, it's just going to be made up of what we call the serous cells. And of course, because of the serous cells, the parotid gland is going to be aiding in production of saliva, which is watery. Okay, what we call watery saliva. Okay, watery saliva, and which is enzyme rich. Okay, watery saliva, which is enzyme rich. Okay, so now that is for the case of the parotid gland, made up of serous cells, which is going to be providing watery saliva that is enzyme rich. Okay, now when we come to what we call the submandibular salivary gland. Okay, the submandibular salivary glands. Which kind of cells are going to be making up what we call the submandibular salivary gland? You see this gland, we are going to be having the blacker cells and even the red cells. So now when we come to our zooming area, you realize that this kind of the gland is going to be having the serous cells and even what we call the mucus cells. For that reason, this submandibular salivary gland is going to be having both. Okay, it's going to be having both. It's going to be having both what we call serous, okay, both serous and then mucus mucus cells. Okay, so now these glands, what we call the submandibular salivary glands, are going to be having both serous and then mucus cells. And this kind of the saliva of the submandibular salivary glands is going to be so much active whenever someone is at rest. Okay, it's going to be producing a lot of the saliva whenever someone is at rest. It produces the largest amount of the saliva when someone is at rest. Okay. Then when we come to this kind of the salivary gland, which is just under the tongue, we said this one is what we call the sublingual. Okay, is what we call the sublingual salivary gland. So now when we come to the sublingual salivary glands, you are realizing that it's going to be having now many of what we call the mucus cells. Generally, the sublingual salivary glands is going to be primarily what we call mucus cells. Okay, it's going to be making up primarily. It's going to be made up of what we call the mucus. It's going to be made up of what we call mucus cells. However, we are going to be having a very little percentage of what we call the serous cells, but primarily sublingual salivary glands is going to be made up of what we call mucus cells. And of course, when we talk of the mucus cells, these are going to be producing mucus. Okay, they're just going to be producing what we call the mucus. Okay, and of course the mucus, which is going to be containing different kind of proteins like protein mucin. Okay, like protein mucin, which makes the saliva to become a bit thick and again bit thick and then viscous. Okay, so now that is the histology part of what we call the salivary glands, which are going to be the major salivary glands. So now how about the intrinsic salivary glands? The intrinsic salivary glands, they are all generally mucus cells. Okay, they are all generally made up of what we call mucus cells. Okay, so now all the intrinsic salivary glands are going to be made up of the mucus cells. Okay, so now this parotid salivary gland, sometimes in children it's going to be sometimes it can get affected by some kind of the viruses like the mumps virus. Okay, so now when the mumps virus attack this kind of the salivary glands, they are going to be making them to swell. Okay, you'll find that more especially in children, you find that the cheek are swelling because of the infected parotid gland. And how do we call that kind of the condition? Due to the infection of the parotid gland by the mumps virus, we just call it parotitis. Okay, we just call it parotiditis. And even also another beautiful term which very many people talk about is what we call the mumps. Okay, they just call that condition as the mump. It is very contagious that spreads through what you call different respiratory secretions. Okay, so now that briefly covers salivary glands, the types, the functions, and of course when you talk about the functions of the saliva, first of all, the saliva is going to be having enzyme rich. So now if it is enzyme rich, meaning that saliva is going to be aiding in what we call chemical digestion of different food substances, like salivary amylase for carbohydrates, lingolipase for fats. Okay, and then of course the saliva maintains lubricates the oral cavity generally, and even also it helps in what we call softening the food substance in the way of forming what we call a semi-liquid substance, which we call the bolus before it is swallowed down the stomach. And even besides that, this saliva also helps to maintain the hygiene of the oral cavity. In that way, we are going to be limiting the possibility of occurrence of what we call the dental caries, which are going to be now which are the holes that are going to be in what we call the teeth. Okay, so now even also the saliva is going to be having immunoglobulin A, which does a small role of what we call the immunity within the oral cavity. Okay, so now the saliva is super very important in the oral cavity, keeping the oral cavity hydrated. Okay, and even also softening different kinds of food before it is swallowed. Okay, so now in the next video, we are going to be now talking about the innervation part. Okay, so now how the nervous system regulates the functioning of the salivary glands. We want to see how the sympathetic nervous system affects the salivary glands, and even also the parasympathetic effect the salivary glands. Okay, that's going to be our next video. Thank you very much for watching, and if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please, you can support me. And that one can be done by a couple of means. You can like the video. You comment down in the comment section. You can share this video to someone else whom you think is in need of this kind of the message. And don't forget to subscribe at the end of it all. Thank you very much for watching. It has been TUMNAD all right from the beginning up now. And of course, as always, until we meet next time.